The Geneva and Hague Conventions regulate the treatment of prisoners of war. But what if the belligerents sign a convention on prisoner treatment and don't practice it? What are the laws governing conflict, and are the laws in war always silent? In all modern wars, we often seem to be a long way from Geneva. Join me, Jan Darasz, for How We Got Here.
A few weeks ago, in the latest of several periodic swaps, Russia and Ukraine exchanged 90 prisoners of war, with the United Arab Emirates overseeing the exchange as an intermediary. Russian officials said prisoners brought home had faced mortal danger in captivity, despite video evidence showing that Russian POWs were in better condition compared to their Ukrainian counterparts. Independent UN investigators have accused Russian authorities of disregarding basic human rights and causing severe suffering to Ukrainian prisoners of war, as well as civilians. Their reports state that Ukrainian POWs were subjected to what they called horrific beatings, verbal abuse and electronic devices that were used on body parts. What is more, they documented numerous incidents of rape and sexual violence committed against women in circumstances which also amount to torture. It is a Russian tradition to abuse prisoners and civilians. During and after the Second World War, they lawlessly murdered thousands of Polish POWs and scholars. Questions regarding the treatment of prisoners of war are as old as war itself. POWs were considered the captor's property throughout the majority of human history. That approach began to shift in the 19th century. A number of international conferences were held, with the international community agreeing that it was necessary to prevent inhumane treatment of prisoners, as well as the use of weapons causing unnecessary harm. Adopted in 1864, the First Geneva Convention defined the rules of international law for the protection of the victims of armed conflicts. Its provisions were expanded in the 1929 Geneva Convention on Prisoners of War and were further revised in the Third Geneva Convention in 1949. Article 4 of the Third Geneva Convention protects captured military personnel and applies these protections from the moment a prisoner is captured until release or repatriation. However, nations vary in their level of adhering to these laws, and historically the treatment of POWs has varied greatly.
I'm delighted to be joined today by Elena Wasylew from the Helsinki Foundation for Human Rights. Welcome to the programme.
Thank you.
Before we come on to the subject of this recent Russo-Ukrainian exchange of prisoners of war, can you give us an idea of why we have these conventions that regulate the treatment of POWs, prisoners of war, in particular? We know about the civilians, the civilian status of in wartime, but what about the prisoners, of the combatants?
So actually the treatment of prisoners of war has been evolving since 19th century. States were realizing that it's important to make sure that combatants that were captured are actually treated with dignity and humanity. Especially after the First World War, countries signed a first convention for the first time that was regulating the situation of prisoners of war and defining their protection once they're captured. And it is believed that actually signing that first convention in 1929 improved the situation of prisoners of war who were captured during the Second World War. So after the Second World War, which saw horrendous atrocities, many of which were also committed in Poland, where we are now.
Yes.
States decided to further develop the convention protecting combatants in captivity, and they signed the Third Geneva Convention, which regulates their situation after they fall into the hands of the enemy.
I mean, a very cynical view, my own view I suppose, is that these are laws which are all very well, as you mentioned, that this cultural advancement of humanity to treat each other better, but the reality of it was that combatants always mistreat, torture, execute, either singly or mass executing prisoners that they've captured. This is true war versus real war.
I don't think so. I think we see in reality that these conventions are protecting people. Of course, it is up to the states what kind of strategy they decide to take and what kind of a state they want to be when they conduct hostilities and wars. But these conventions have traditionally protected prisoners of war and other protected groups during the war. So I think it's very important to sustain them, because otherwise we commit as countries to commit senseless acts of violence, and we will go into a very dark place, and it's very difficult to come back from that place.
So there's also, apart from the cultural and moral imperative, there's also a self-interest that if we treat theirs humanely, they will treat ours.
Of course. I mean, imagine being a soldier. If you fight in Ukraine today, whether you are on the Russian side or Ukrainian side, you risk your life, right, by going to the army. But if there are no rules of how you're treated in captivity, that means that you're also risking being tortured and subjected to completely inhumane, horrendous acts. So it is in the interest of all warring parties to commit to specific rules that are making sure that we can have a war. As much as I agree with you, wars are inhumane for me in principle, but they are not illegal. But there must be rules that are regulating them. So so we don't completely emerge into chaos and inhumanity.
Into the dark.
Yes. Primitive times.
Yes, circles of hell. Okay, we've had a recent exchange of prisoners, and we've seen horrendous photographs of the way the Ukrainian soldiers were treated, not just men but women also who were captured. How do you account for the disparity of treatment between the Russian treatment of Ukrainians and the Ukrainian treatment of Russian prisoners? Is this on the Russian side? Is this a policy? Is it a few individuals just performing evil acts, or is this a state policy to mistreat Ukrainian prisoners?
I must emphasize that as Helsinki Foundation for Human Rights, we're not operating in Ukraine, and we're not such an organization that has a mandate to monitor the situations of prisoners of war or conduct interviews with them after they are released. However, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has published very detailed reports, and we follow them very closely. It's a complex question, but I'll try to unpack it. First of all, when it comes to torture and a situation in detention, whether it is related to prisoners of war, so combatants who are captured, or civilians, we do have mounting evidence now that use of torture is endemic. It is routine in detention, and it does appear to be systematic and intentional. So it does have signs of a policy. It makes sense, because why do you use torture? You don't only use torture to extract information, as we see in the movies. You use torture to humiliate people and to extract fear, right? So the purpose is that people are afraid and paralyzed by fear. So we do see that across detention facilities in areas controlled by the Russian Federation. That's an important point to start with. Another thing, in terms of why we do see the disparity between the treatment of prisoners of war that are held in Ukraine and in areas controlled by the Russian Federation. One thing important to mention is that it's not like prisoners of war who are kept, who are held in Ukraine, the Russian prisoners of war, are not subjected to violence. There were cases documented also of torture against them. However, if we compare, indeed, it's quite striking, the difference in the scale. I believe that this is connected to the fact that the International Red Cross, the International Committee of the Red Cross, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and other independent organizations have access to the prisoners of war who are held in the Ukrainian territory, so to the Russian prisoners of war. I think it's a game changer. It really makes a difference, because that also encourages institutions and state actors to adhere to the principles of the Geneva Conventions and other human rights treaties.
How-
In Russia, just to say sorry, in
Yes.
Russia we don't have access. So the International Committee of the Red Cross, they do report regularly that while they have access to some prisoners of war, Ukrainian prisoners of war held in the Ukrainian territories, this access is not regular and is not full, which makes it much more difficult to actually monitor what's
Yes.
happening in detention there.
We've accumulated a whole mass of evidence against individuals and against state authorities, on the Russian side at least. What hope do you have for some resolution coming out in presumably 10, 20 years' time when there's a regime change in Russia or a change in mentality of the Russian authorities? Is it important to get the evidence first and to keep it?
Yes, I have hope. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing, and we wouldn't be doing what we do as Helsinki Foundation for Human Rights. I think as Poland, we have a beautiful, fascinating history of a dramatic transition and change of our regime. Poland, I will say that, I'm sure I will answer your question, but I think it's important to mention also, because very few people know, that Poland actually is one of the countries investigating crimes under international
the conclusion
law.
of your report. Yes.
Committed in Ukraine. We do have a unit in our General Prosecutor's Office that collects evidence of crimes under international law committed in Ukraine. They take testimonies from some of the refugee victims and survivors who are in Poland, and they collaborate with Europol and other countries, Ukraine and other countries in Europe, to exchange evidence and prepare potential cases. And I am really proud that Poland is actually doing that, because given our history and how close we are to the war in Ukraine, and the fact that we have so many refugees who've experienced such atrocities,
Yes.
it's really important that we do that. So that's one thing. Justice is also very slow. It is really not easy to gather evidence that will meet the threshold that is required in the courts to prove such complex and serious, some of the most egregious violations under international law. So it takes time. We saw after conflicts in Rwanda, Bosnia and Herzegovina, former Yugoslavia,
Right, yes.
that it takes a long time. But it's very important. We must fight impunity, because as we said in the beginning, if we don't defend and protect a system of human rights and the values that we've committed to, then what do we become as a state of humanity overall, right? So I think this is really important. Also, we see from history that today it may seem impossible that some of the state officials from the Russian Federation, whether they are army officials or political officials responsible for this war and the crimes committed during this war, that it's unthinkable for us they'll be apprehended. But the reality shows that they will, right?
Yes, the Bosnian...
Milosevic, Mladic,
yes.
Karadzic, they all actually face trial.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think it is possible, and that's why it is important to continue generating gathering evidence. I think we've been very fast with the conflict in Ukraine. It's unprecedented how fast the collection of evidence has started, and all the documentation of crimes under international law. So I'm actually hopeful.
Is it a case that Ukraine needs weapons, ammunition, money to win the war, and it's still is it devoting much of its resources to documenting atrocities, not just against its military personnel, but against its civilian personnel? Is that a huge effort on behalf of the Ukrainian state in a war that you could say, well, it should win it first, and then you can do the prosecution afterwards?
That's an excellent question. Thank you for that question. Yes, actually, the Ukrainian justice system began gathering evidence and prosecuting cases after 2014, because for them, they always emphasize the war started in 2014.
Yes.
Since the full-scale invasion, they've received an injection of additional support, and there is a separate unit within General Prosecutor's Office that is working very hard to gather evidence and to prosecute these cases. It is extremely challenging. The civil society in Ukraine also mobilized, and they work very hard to support the justice system in collection of evidence, and they use some of the most modern technologies. It's not that they
It's a very well documented war and visually, isn't it?
Incredible. I mean, I am at awe with my colleagues from Ukraine, with the support of organizations such as Human Rights Watch. They don't only collect testimonies from witnesses, which is really important, also individually for the witnesses and survivors to be able to give their testimonies, but they also have all this modern technology that is allowing them to gather satellite imaging evidence,
yes,
collect data from the internet. It's really incredible. So yeah, the perpetrators definitely cannot feel safe when it comes to the mounting evidence that's there. However, having said that, it is overwhelming. I mean, the Prosecutor General's office in Ukraine has gathered over 200,000 cases, information about 200,000 violations of international law. It's impossible for them to prosecute all of that in a reasonable amount of time. And I think that's why it's really important for countries such as Poland, European countries, other countries, to also exercise universal jurisdiction and prosecute some of these cases
on their own
our
territory.
court. Yes, this is possible. And I think in Poland we will be having more and more discussions about the possibility of that. Of course, in a symbolic measure.
Sure.
Clearly, we're not going to prosecute thousands of cases in Poland. And also, it's important to support the work of the international tribunals and the International Criminal Court.
A final question to you. You mentioned the idea of terrorizing a population or a military population to cow them into submission. Is that... It always seems to have a counterproductive effect. I'm not just talking about the current bombing of the cancer hospital that we've seen recently.
The Children's Hospital.
The Children's Hospital. But also the Allies did the same to Germany. It was the bombed German cities flat. It always seemed to be... The Germans also did the same to the Allies, by the way.
Poland.
And Poland, of course, Katyn Forest. This kind of terrorist impulse always seems to have a counterproductive effect on the people you are trying to terrorize.
I think what we see at the moment in Ukraine and in many other places I have worked throughout my work so far, you always see that, as I said in the beginning, the purpose is to weaken the society. You're committing these crimes because you want people to be afraid,
yes,
you want them to be divided, and you want these people to lose trust in their own government. That is the purpose of what the Russian Federation is doing, in my opinion. And it's also a matter of dividing all of the countries and to undermine democracy and the international human rights system we believe in. I think it's incredible to see in Ukraine that people, despite these dangers and the daily bombings and dangers of war, are still committed to fight for their country. I find it incredible, and I think we should do everything in our in what's possible for us in Poland to support their efforts. From our side, as a human rights organization, we support Ukrainian civil society with documentation, yes, of international human rights.
I mean, we know Poland has a long memory about these things, about, yeah, Katyn Forest and some of the atrocities that Germans have committed, so it doesn't have a time limit on it.
No, and this is a good thing yeah, exactly. There's no statute of limitation of war crimes, so I do hope that we will see accountability one day.
Okay. Thank you very much, Elena Wasylew, for coming on to our programme. Great to have you.
Thank you.
So that's all we have time for today. Do join us next time for How We Got Here.